This is Byron Gordon at SES Chicago for the SES Conference Channel. It's day one at SES Chicago. We just heard the opening keynote from Professor Lawrence Lessig of Stanford University, law professor. Professor Lessig, in your talk, you deal with copyright, and your book Remix is about that. Could you sum up for those of us who are watching this now, what's wrong with copyright law today as you see it?
Well, copyright law serves an important objective, which is to create incentives for artists to create great new work. But it was architected for a radically different technology. It was architected in a world where copies were the exception, and the normal way in which we shared and did things with culture didn't produce any copies at all. Obviously, that technological assumption has been inverted. Now copying is as common as breathing. And a regime that was set up to regulate every single copy is totally inefficient and unnecessarily burdensome in the context of the current digital technology. So what I think has to happen is we need to translate copyright law from this old architecture with its objectives into a new architecture pursuing the same objectives, but making sure that it's not regulating radically beyond what it needs to achieve its aims.
You talked about, in your keynote, about how copyright law is being used to criminalize a generation, and one of your remedies for that is creating or building the sharing economy or hybrid economy. Can you give us some examples of that, and what does that look like for people who might not yet are able to visualize that?
Well, everybody's familiar with the most prominent examples of the sharing economy. For example, Wikipedia was created with a sharing economy where people are creating and adding value without expecting compensation in return, but just because this is what they want to do. Before that, much of the free software movement was exactly inside that sharing economy, where people are creating free software, including what eventually became the GNU Linux operating system, totally because they just believed they wanted to contribute to the creation of this infrastructure without compensation being at the core. But what I think is most interesting is the way that this sharing economy is now becoming part of what I call the hybrid. And the hybrid is when you've got commercial entities that are trying to leverage value out of the sharing economy. So Flickr is a simple example where obviously there's a sharing activity that's at the core of Flickr, but Yahoo intends to leverage value out of that sharing activity by putting it in a framework that becomes more valuable for the users and they can begin to profit from it. Linux, or GNU Linux, became in the same way a kind of hybrid when companies like Red Hat came along and figured out how they could leverage this sharing activity of building this operating system into a commercial value for that company. So these examples of the hybrid, I think, are the future of what internet commerce looks like. And they raise a whole bunch of important questions about how exactly do you negotiate the relationship between the sharing activity and the commercial objectives, and that's part of what I was talking about today.
In your book Remix, towards the end, I believe you discuss solutions that need to be acted upon. Can you talk or name, say, the first three that should be acted upon?
Well, one that I think is very important is that we recognize this war of prohibition that we've been waging against our kids to stop them from, quote, sharing against the law. Has got to come to an end. We've got to stop this war. Not because I believe what they're doing is right, but I believe that the law regulating them is a total failure, that we don't see any drop-off in peer-to-peer file sharing. It's only increased. And rather than fighting this hopeless war, we ought to just figure a way to compensate artists and give up the attempt to control that kind of sharing. There have been lots of proposals for how to do that. I think Congress needs to consider those. That's number one. Number two, copyright law has got to give up its obsession with the copy. It's got to stop worrying about copying as the trigger for this regulation and worry about activities that are genuinely commercial-related activities that need to be regulated to create incentives. And third, I think the law has got to become much more efficient. I mean, this is a property system, but it's the most inefficient property system ever devised by man because there's no simple way to know who owns what. So, when Google, for example, tried to build the Google book search that was going to make 18 million books available online to be searched and indexed the way the internet is, the first thing they hid is that 75% of these books were presumptively under copyright, but there was no easy person to go to ask for permission to include them in their archive. So this is because the copyright law was written assuming you wouldn't need to keep track of who the copyright owners are after some period of time. And so therefore we have this total mess of regulated works with nobody to even know who to get permission from to use those works. So those changes, I think, are essential in the law right away to make the law more efficient and achieve its objectives and not criminalize a generation.
Finally, if people want to find out more or involve themselves in the reform of copyright law, where should they go? What organizations should they learn more about?
Well, three organizations that are particularly important to me are, number one, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which has been fighting these issues for, since the early 1990s. Number two, Public Knowledge, which is an organization in DC that lobbies in this space and to some very good ends. Those are people who are working on changing the law, but I've been behind an organization called Creative Commons, which is not about changing the law, which says keep copyright law the way it is, or if copyright is kept the way it is, we can build on top of it a simpler, more flexible, more sensible system for copyright, and that's what Creative Commons did with the licenses that they deployed. And as people use these licenses, they signal that they believe in something other than the extremes in this debate, and that would be an important organization to support right now.
Professor Lawrence Lessig, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
I'm Byron Gordon for the SES Conference Channel at SES Chicago. Keep watching.